For years he sat, unwavering, through the harshest winters and the blistering heat, eyes locked on the empty road. What was he waiting for? Then, one fateful evening, everything changed. Hollow Creek was the kind of town that felt untouched by time, where the streets bore the weight of stories long since told, and the air smelled of rain-drenched asphalt and forgotten dreams. It was a place where nothing ever truly changed, where the old diner on the corner still had the same rusted jukebox, where the townsfolk greeted each other with the same weary smiles, and where the past lingered like a shadow in the late afternoon sun. And in the midst of it all, there was Max. The German Shepherd had become a fixture of Hollow Creek, a silent guardian tethered to a single place, an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town. Nobody knew exactly how long he had been there, only that his presence was constant, unwavering. Day after day, through summer's heat and winter's bitter cold, Max sat in the same spot, his golden brown eyes locked onto the empty road that stretched into the distance. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. The town had learned to live around him. The children, at first curious, had tried to coax him into play, tossing sticks his way, calling out to him with cheerful voices. But Max never moved, never so much as twitched at their excitement. He was polite in his stillness, never aggressive, never fearful, simply steadfast. Mrs. Holloway, the elderly woman who ran the bakery, had taken a particular liking to him. Every morning before dawn, when the scent of fresh bread seeped into the streets, she would carry a small bowl of warm stew or leftover pastries to him. She would talk to him in that soft, knowing voice of hers, as if he were an old friend. "You must have loved someone an awful lot to wait this long," she'd whisper, placing the bowl near his paws before retreating, always careful never to push too hard. Max would eat, but never eagerly. His movements were slow, methodical, as if eating were merely a necessity rather than a pleasure. Then there was Officer Grant. The town's only policeman, Grant had tried several times to take Max to the local shelter, convinced that the dog deserved more than a life spent waiting for something that might never return. But Max was stubborn. Each time Grant approached, leash in hand, Max would look at him with those steady, unreadable eyes, and something in the officer's chest would tighten. It wasn't fear, no, it was something closer to respect, maybe even sorrow. "You're gonna break my heart, buddy," Grant murmured one evening, kneeling beside him. "You can't stay here forever. Ain't right." Max simply blinked, and so Grant let him be. But nobody watched Max as closely as Ethan. The mechanic worked across the street, in a shop where the scent of motor oil and burnt rubber clung to the air. He had noticed Max months ago, just like everyone else, but where others had accepted the dog's presence as part of the town's scenery, Ethan found himself drawn to him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because he understood what it was like to wait for something that would never come back. 2 years ago, Ethan had been a different man. He had laughed more, carried less weight in his shoulders, and walked through life with a heart unburdened by grief. Then the fire had taken everything: his wife, his daughter, his home. In one night, his world had turned to ash, and nothing had been the same since. He had tried to move forward, burying himself in work, in the rhythmic clatter of tools against metal, in the routine of fixing things that could be repaired, unlike the past. But grief was a patient thing. It clung to him in the quiet moments, in the spaces between seconds, in the nights when the silence felt too loud. And then there was Max. For months, Ethan had watched him from a distance, observing the way the dog sat so still, so endlessly patient. It was that patience that unsettled him the most. Because it was the patience of someone who refused to give up, of someone who believed, against all reason, that what was lost could still be found. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the world in hues of fire and gold, Ethan made a decision. He sat on the curb across from Max, a plate of leftover steak resting beside him. He didn't call out, didn't whistle or clap his hands like so many had before. He simply sat. Minutes passed, then an hour. The world around them shifted. The hum of distant cars, the occasional murmur of voices, the whisper of wind through the trees. And then, just when Ethan thought Max would never move, the dog did. Slowly, cautiously, Max inched closer. He stopped just a foot away, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Max lay down. Not at the gas station, not at the edge of the road, but right beside Ethan. A silent understanding passed between them. Ethan exhaled, his fingers brushing against the cool pavement. He turned his gaze to the road, the same road Max had been watching for so long, and he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" Max didn't answer, but the way he stared into the distance told Ethan everything he needed to know. He was waiting for someone, and he wasn't going to leave until they came back. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something he had long since buried. Hope. The first storm of the season rolled into Hollow Creek like an omen. The sky, once painted in soft autumn hues, darkened into a churning mass of gray, and the air carried the weight of something impending. The townspeople hurried to secure their windows, to shelter themselves from the downpour that loomed over the horizon. But Max never moved. Ethan watched him from the shop, hands coated in grease, wrench resting uselessly on the hood of an old Chevy. His gut twisted. It had been months now, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that Max was just a dog, an animal running on instinct, he knew better. Max wasn't just waiting, he was mourning. The rain came hard that evening, lashing against the asphalt in thick sheets. The abandoned gas station, with its shattered windows and rusted pumps, barely provided any cover, but Max remained in his usual spot. His fur clung to his body, soaked through, and still, his gaze remained locked onto that same stretch of road. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Stubborn damn dog," he muttered, grabbing an old raincoat and heading outside. The moment he stepped into the storm, the cold bit into him, rain seeping into his clothes instantly. Max didn't even flinch when Ethan approached, didn't so much as turn his head. He was too focused, too lost in whatever promise he had made to himself. Ethan crouched beside him, the sound of rain hammering against the pavement filling the space between them. "You're gonna die out here," he said, voice barely audible over the downpour. Max blinked but didn't move. Ethan ran a hand through his wet hair, exhaling through gritted teeth. He had spent years keeping his distance from things that could hurt him, things that could be lost. But this dog, this damn dog, had wormed his way into his life, whether he liked it or not. He reached out, hesitating only for a second before wrapping the raincoat over Max's soaked body. Max stiffened at the touch but didn't resist. "Come on," Ethan urged, "just for the night." For the first time, Max broke his gaze away from the road and looked up at Ethan. There was something ancient in those eyes, something raw and unspoken. Then, after a long, agonizing moment, Max stood. Ethan didn't lead him. Max simply followed. Inside the garage, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, but it was warm. Ethan grabbed an old towel, rubbing it through Max's fur, though the dog hardly seemed to notice. He just sat there, water dripping from his coat, eyes still distant. Ethan leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing," he admitted. "But you're not dying out there, got it?" Max let out a low huff, something that could have almost been acknowledgement. That night, Ethan laid out an old blanket in the corner of the shop. Max curled up but didn't sleep. Not really. Every so often Ethan would catch him lifting his head, glancing toward the garage door as if the road still called to him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt the weight of understanding settle in his bones. He knew what it was like to wait for someone who wasn't coming back. And the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The air smelled of damp earth and petrichor. Max stood by the garage door, waiting. Ethan sighed. "You're really gonna do this every damn day, huh?" Max wagged his tail, just once, barely perceptible. But Ethan saw it. Shaking his head, he grabbed a thermos of coffee and stepped outside with him. If Max was going to sit and wait, then so was he. And that was how it started. Each morning, Ethan would bring his coffee, sometimes a sandwich, and he'd sit on the curb beside Max, staring at the empty road. He told himself it was ridiculous, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, he knew better. Weeks passed, then a month. Ethan started asking around town, piecing together whatever scraps of information he could about Max's past. Mrs. Holloway had her theories. "That dog's been waiting longer than anyone remembers," she said one evening, watching Max through her bakery window. "Some say he belonged to a trucker that used to pass through here often. Others think maybe a soldier. Either way, whoever he's waiting for, they're not coming back." Ethan frowned. There was something cruel about it. The thought of Max waiting, always waiting, for someone who had already forgotten him, or worse, was gone. Then came the night everything changed. It started with a sound, distant, faint, almost easy to ignore. But Max heard it first. His ears perked, body going rigid as he lifted his head from his paws. Ethan, half asleep on the couch in his shop, stirred when he noticed the shift. "Max?" The dog didn't move. Then Ethan heard it too. An engine. Not just any engine. One that rumbled with familiarity, growing louder as it approached. Max's tail thumped once, twice. Then he was on his feet, bolting toward the garage door. Ethan barely had time to process what was happening before Max let out a sound he had never heard before. A whimper. A desperate, hopeful whimper. Ethan's chest tightened. He scrambled to his feet just as the headlights of a semi-truck cut through the darkness, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. The truck slowed as it neared the gas station, pulling over to the curb with a heavy exhale of air brakes. Max was trembling. Ethan had never seen him like this. The truck door creaked open, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a man stepped out. His beard was grayer than it probably used to be, his face lined with years of stories. He wore an old cap, one that looked like it had seen countless miles. His eyes, weary and searching, swept over the empty gas station, then landed on Max. Everything stilled. The world, the night, the air between them. Max let out a single bark. The man's breath hitched. "Max?" Ethan watched as the dog, who had spent years waiting, who had never once moved from that damn spot, sprinted. Not walked, not hesitated. Sprinted. The man barely had time to kneel before Max crashed into him, paws on his shoulders, whimpers turning into frantic, joyful cries. The man's arms wrapped around him, fingers burying deep into the fur of a friend he thought he had lost forever. His voice broke. "God, boy, I thought you were gone." Max licked his face, tail wagging so hard his entire body swayed. Ethan stood frozen, throat tight. He didn't know this man, didn't know his story, but he knew this moment. It was the moment Max had been waiting for, the moment that made every second of patience worth it. And as Ethan turned away, giving them their time, he felt something shift in his own chest. For the first time in years, it didn't feel so heavy, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one learning to heal. Max had never known anything other than waiting. For years, his life had been measured in sunrises and sunsets, in passing cars and shifting seasons. But now, everything had changed. His person, his home, had returned. The man, whom Ethan later learned was named Tom Grayson, had driven nearly 1,000 miles back to Hollow Creek after a trucker friend had passed through town and mentioned the German Shepherd still waiting outside the abandoned gas station. "I didn't think he'd still be here," Tom admitted, voice thick with emotion as he ran his fingers through Max's fur. "God, I didn't think he'd remember me." But Max did. There wasn't an ounce of hesitation in the way he stayed glued to Tom's side, as if afraid that even a single inch of distance might make him disappear again. Ethan watched from his shop, a strange, unshakable weight settling in his chest. He had never doubted that Max had belonged to someone important. But he had also come to believe, in some quiet, bitter part of himself, that this someone was never coming back. And yet, here Tom was. The truth, however, was never simple. Tom wasn't just a man returning to reunite with his dog. He was a man carrying ghosts of his own. The first crack in the fairy tale reunion came when Ethan offered Tom a cup of coffee, and the man hesitated before accepting. His hands shook when he lifted the cup to his lips, and his eyes darted around the shop like a man used to looking over his shoulder. "So," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence, "you left him behind." Tom winced. His gaze flickered to Max, who sat at his feet, staring up at him with unrelenting devotion. "I never wanted to," he murmured. "I didn't have a choice." Ethan scoffed. "There's always a choice." Tom exhaled slowly. "Not when you're drowning." And then the story came out. Tom had been a trucker for years, a man constantly in motion, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Max had been his companion through it all, riding shotgun on cross-country hauls, keeping him company through endless miles of lonely highways. But 2 years ago, everything had come crashing down. Tom had been in debt, bad debt, a gambling problem that had spiraled beyond his control, swallowing everything in its path. He had tried to outrun it, taking job after job, but the walls had kept closing in. And then, one day, they caught up to him. Men he owed money to found him at a rest stop outside of Denver. They had given him a choice: pay up or disappear. Tom had chosen to disappear. "I thought if I left town, left everything behind, I could fix it," Tom admitted, his voice low and raw. "I thought I'd come back for him. But weeks turned into months, and then I just couldn't face it." Ethan clenched his jaw. "So he waited," he said, voice edged with quiet fury. "While you ran." Tom flinched. "Yeah." The words sat heavy between them. Max, oblivious to the complexity of human guilt, pressed his head against Tom's knee, letting out a soft sigh. Ethan wanted to hate him, wanted to tell him to leave, to get back in his truck and never look back. But when he looked at Max, when he saw the way the dog leaned into the touch of the man he had waited years for, he couldn't. It wasn't that simple. It never was. "You staying?" Ethan asked finally. Tom hesitated. And there it was. The thing Ethan had been afraid of. Because love alone wasn't always enough to make someone stay. Max had spent years waiting for a man who had left him behind. And Ethan had a sickening feeling that, deep down, he already knew how this story would end. Tom stayed in town for a week. For 7 days, Hollow Creek watched as Max followed his owner everywhere. They were inseparable, the kind of pair that made people believe in second chances. Tom took him on long walks around the town, let him curl up beside him on the front porch of the motel he was staying in. He bought him new food, better food. He even stopped by Ethan's garage, helping him with odd jobs, trying, perhaps, to make up for something. But Ethan wasn't stupid. He saw the way Tom flinched whenever his phone rang, the way his hands shook when he checked his messages. The past wasn't done with him. And then, on the 8th day, it happened. Tom disappeared. Ethan showed up at the motel that morning, expecting to see Max and his owner sitting outside like usual. Instead, he found the room empty. The bed untouched. The truck gone. Max was still there, sitting on the curb, waiting. Ethan stared. For a long moment, all he could do was stand there, heart pounding with something he couldn't name. Number not again. He stepped forward, kneeling beside Max, pressing a hand against the dog's thick fur. "I'm sorry, buddy," he murmured. Max whined. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He should have known. He should have never let himself believe that things could be different. People didn't change. They ran. They left. Ethan knew that better than anyone. Max, however, didn't seem to accept it. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting at the gas station. He was waiting at the motel. Days passed, then a week. And still, Max sat there, staring at the road, ears perking up at every passing truck, every familiar rumble of an engine. Ethan tried to pull him away, tried to tell him it was over, but Max wouldn't leave. Not this time. Ethan felt something break inside him. Maybe, in another life, he would have walked away too. But not now. Not when he had spent the past year watching this dog refuse to give up on something that had already abandoned him. So Ethan sat down beside him, and together, they waited. It took another week before Ethan finally accepted the truth. Tom wasn't coming back. The man had barely been in town for 7 days, and yet he had managed to crack open something in both of them. And now, he had left them to pick up the pieces. Ethan wasn't sure what made him do it. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was anger. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone either. But one morning, as the sun rose over Hollow Creek, painting the town in soft gold, he reached out and placed a firm hand on Max's head. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." Max hesitated. Then, slowly, painfully, he stood. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even relief. It was just acceptance. Max followed him. Not back to the gas station, not to the motel, but home. Ethan didn't know what the future looked like. Didn't know if Max would ever stop waiting. But for now, they had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The first few days were the hardest. Max wasn't used to leaving the spot where he had spent years waiting, and Ethan wasn't used to having someone depend on him. They were both learning, adjusting in their own ways. At first, Max still tried to return to the motel, to the roadside, to the empty spaces where Tom had left him behind. Every morning, Ethan would wake to find him standing by the door, ears perked, eyes searching the horizon. And every morning, Ethan would sigh, grab his coffee, and sit beside him. "He's not coming back, buddy," he murmured once, the words thick with an understanding that neither of them wanted to accept. Max didn't react, but he also didn't leave. That was something, at least. Ethan hadn't planned on keeping him. Not really. He told himself he was just helping Max through the transition. That once the dog got used to life without Tom, maybe someone else in town would take him in. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Max wasn't going anywhere. Mrs. Holloway had offered to take him. Even Officer Grant had suggested bringing him home. Each time, Ethan had given the same answer. "He's fine where he is." Because the truth was, Ethan had gotten used to having him around. Max followed him to work, curling up near the garage entrance while Ethan fixed cars and half-heartedly scolded him for getting in the way. At night, he slept by the couch, his soft, steady breathing filling the quiet spaces that used to be unbearable. And when Ethan woke up gasping from the nightmares, the ones where fire licked at the walls of his past, where the smell of smoke still clung to his skin, Max was there, silent, steady, a presence in the dark, a tether to something real. The first time Ethan took Max on a drive, the dog's ears twitched at every passing car, his eyes darting toward every truck that rumbled down the road. He still looked for Tom. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter. "Yeah, I know," he muttered. "Takes time." Max turned his head slightly, as if listening. It was the first time Ethan let himself admit that maybe they were both waiting for something. Maybe Max was waiting for Tom, and maybe Ethan was waiting for a version of himself that had burned away with everything he had lost. Then, one evening, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Ethan had just locked up the garage, Max trotting beside him as they made their way home. The sun was slipping beneath the horizon, the air thick with the scent of rain from a storm earlier in the afternoon. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. He rarely got calls these days, but something in his gut told him to pick up. "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. "Ethan?" "Tom." Ethan stopped walking. His grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching. Max, sensing the shift in energy, tilted his head. Ethan forced himself to breathe. "You got some nerve calling me." "I know," Tom said, and he sounded different. Not the man who had smiled and laughed while throwing a ball for Max. Not the man who had looked whole again, if only for a moment. This version of Tom sounded tired, fractured. "I need your help," he said. Ethan scoffed. "Yeah? Kind of late for that." "I messed up." "No kidding." A heavy silence. Ethan wanted to hang up, wanted to tell Tom to go to hell. But then he heard something in the background, something that made his blood run cold. A cough. Ragged. Strained. Max let out a soft whimper, shifting closer. Tom's next words were barely a whisper. "I think I'm dying." Ethan didn't hesitate. He should have. He should have let Tom deal with the mess he had made, should have walked away like Tom had done to Max. But something inside him, something raw and unrelenting, wouldn't let him. So he drove. The address Tom had given him was 2 hours away, just outside a truck stop along the highway. Max sat in the passenger seat, ears alert, nose pressed to the window. Ethan didn't speak. He barely let himself think. Because if he thought too much, he'd remember the way Tom had left. And if he remembered, he might turn the car around. But when he pulled into the lot, his stomach twisted. Tom was sitting on the curb, looking smaller than Ethan had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his skin pale, and when he lifted his head, there were dark circles beneath his eyes. Max let out a high-pitched whimper. Tom's lips twitched, like he wanted to smile, but couldn't quite manage it. "Hey, buddy." Max bolted from the truck before Ethan could react. The dog collided with Tom, pressing his head against the man's chest, tail wagging frantically. Tom sucked in a breath, fingers digging into Max's fur. Ethan stayed by the truck, watching. After a moment, Tom looked up. "I didn't think he'd still—" "He never stopped," Ethan interrupted, voice hard. Tom swallowed. He didn't argue. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Ethan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" Tom ran a hand through his graying hair. "Lung cancer." Ethan's stomach dropped. "I don't have much time," Tom admitted, voice barely audible. I wanted to come back for him. For Max, I did. But I kept screwing it up, and then it got worse." He let out a humorless laugh. "Guess I ran out of time." Max whined, nuzzling against him. Ethan's throat tightened. Because suddenly, this wasn't about blame anymore. This wasn't about anger. It was about a man who had lost everything, just like Ethan had. It was about Max, who had spent years waiting for someone who was already slipping away. Ethan sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "All right." Tom blinked. "All right?" "Yeah." Ethan stepped forward, kneeling down beside them. Max turned his head, pressing against Ethan's side, and for the first time, Ethan let himself reach out, not just for the dog, but for the man who had broken him, and for the chance to fix something before it was too late. "You're coming home," Ethan said, voice rough but certain. "Both of you." Tom's breath hitched. I don't know if I... Ethan cut him off with a look. You're coming home. Max let out a soft huff, settling between them. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, none of them had to wait anymore. The drive back to Hollow Creek was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind of silence Ethan had expected. It was something else. A quiet understanding. A moment of stillness before the inevitable storm. Max lay stretched across the back seat, his head resting on Tom's lap. Every so often, Tom's fingers would run absently through his fur, the kind of touch that was second nature, one built from years of trust, of love, of a bond that had never truly broken. Ethan stole a glance in the rearview mirror. Tom looked exhausted, his breathing uneven, his skin too pale under the dim glow of the passing streetlights. You should have told someone, Ethan muttered, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. Tom exhaled, a sound that was half a laugh, half a sigh. Yeah, I should have done a lot of things. Ethan didn't argue. There was no point in it now. Instead, he focused on the road, on the familiar curves and turns that led them back home. Mrs. Holloway cried when she saw Tom again. She smacked him on the shoulder, hard enough to make him wince, before pulling him into a tight hug. You damn fool, she muttered, her voice shaking. You let that poor dog sit out there for years. Tom didn't try to defend himself. He just nodded, accepting the weight of his mistakes. Max, oblivious to the complexities of human forgiveness, pressed himself against Tom's leg, his tail wagging softly. Officer Grant stopped by that evening, too. He didn't say much, just gave Tom a long, scrutinizing look before tipping his hat and muttering, "Glad you came back." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something. And in the end, that was enough. The weeks passed in a blur. Tom moved into the spare bedroom at Ethan's house. It wasn't much, just a small space with an old bed and a single window that overlooked the quiet streets of Hollow Creek. But it was home. Max adjusted quickly. He split his time between Ethan and Tom, always keeping both of them within sight, as if afraid they'd disappear if he let them out of his reach. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. He was just living. Tom started treatment at the small clinic in town. The prognosis wasn't good. The cancer had spread too far, too fast. But he was fighting, and Ethan, despite everything, was fighting alongside him. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Ethan found Tom sitting on the porch, Max curled up at his feet. The air smelled like rain, like the promise of another storm just beyond the hills. Ethan sat down beside him, stretching his legs out. Tom didn't look at him when he spoke. "I don't have much time left." Ethan clenched his jaw. "I know. I didn't want to die out there." Tom's voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. "Alone." Ethan swallowed hard. "You're not alone." Tom let out a breath, nodding slightly. They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of things that didn't need to be said out loud. Then, finally, Tom reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. "You take care of him when I'm gone?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yeah." Tom smiled, something small and tired, but real. "Good." Max let out a soft sigh, nuzzling against Tom's hand. And for the first time in years, there was nothing left to wait for, because they had already found their way home. Hollow Creek moved at its own slow rhythm, unaffected by the passing of time. The seasons came and went, marking the land with subtle changes, the crisp bite of autumn air, the first dusting of winter snow, the return of spring's gentle warmth. The people, too, remained steady, their lives woven into the fabric of a town that had learned to carry both loss and love in quiet ways. For Ethan, time had always felt like an enemy. After the fire that had taken his wife and daughter, the days stretched endlessly, a hollow existence filled only with routine and work. But now, for the first time in years, time felt different. It wasn't something to endure. It was something to live. Tom had lasted longer than the doctors predicted. Maybe it was because he had found peace in the end. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running anymore. He spent his final months exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by people who had forgiven him, by a dog who had never stopped loving him, by a man who had, despite everything, given him a second chance. When the end came, it was quiet. No last-minute confessions, no desperate attempts to hold on. Just a cold morning, a stillness in the air, and Max curled up beside Tom's bed, refusing to move until there was nothing left to wait for. Ethan had never been good with grief. He didn't know what to say, how to process it, but he made sure Tom was buried in Hollow Creek, in a small cemetery that overlooked the town. Not in some anonymous city where he had no roots, not forgotten along the side of a highway, but here, home, and Max. Max stayed, not because he had nowhere else to go, not because Ethan forced him to, but because, after everything, they belonged together. The first few weeks after Tom's passing were the hardest. Max still searched for him. Ethan would catch him lingering by the door at night, staring at the empty space where Tom used to sit on the porch. Every so often, when they passed the cemetery on their evening walks, Max would pause, ears twitching, eyes distant. Ethan understood that kind of grief, the way it never really leaves, how it lingers in the quiet spaces. "You miss him, huh?" he murmured one evening as they sat outside, watching the last traces of daylight fade. Max let out a slow breath, his body pressing slightly against Ethan's leg. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "Me too." There was no rushing grief, no fixing it, no magic words to make it disappear. But there was time. Time to heal. Time to move forward, not away from the pain, but with it. Months passed. Hollow Creek moved on, the way it always did. The garage kept Ethan busy, customers coming in with the same old problems: oil leaks, busted transmissions, the occasional truck that needed more work than it was worth. Max became a permanent fixture there, always stretched out near the entrance, tail thumping lazily whenever someone greeted him. The town had accepted him long ago, but now they looked at him differently. Not as the dog who waited, but as the dog who had finally found where he belonged. One afternoon, Mrs. Holloway stopped by with a fresh loaf of bread, the way she had done so many times before. She stood by the door for a moment, watching as Ethan worked beneath the hood of a Chevy, Max lying nearby. "You've changed," she mused. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, raising an eyebrow. "That so?" She smiled, but there was something knowing in her gaze. "Used to be, you looked like you were waiting for something too, like you weren't really here." Ethan glanced at Max, who lifted his head slightly, ears perking. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been waiting. Waiting for a sign that life could be more than just surviving. Waiting for something, someone, to pull him out of the past. He hadn't realized it before. But Max had saved him, just as much as Ethan had saved Max. Mrs. Holloway handed him the bread, giving Max a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Some things are worth waiting for, you know." Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." That evening, Ethan sat on the front porch, a cold beer in one hand, the other resting idly on Max's back. The sky stretched wide above them, painted in the soft golden hues of a setting sun. The road in front of them stretched on, the same road Max had once watched so faithfully. But this time, he wasn't waiting. He was home. And for the first time in a long time, so was Ethan. Some things are worth waiting for. Some stories don't end the way we expect, but they still bring us where we need to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the unshakable loyalty of a dog, or the way second chances can come when we least expect them, consider sharing it. Maybe you know someone who's waiting for something, someone who needs to hear that they're not alone. And if you have a story of your own, a story of a dog's love, of loss, of redemption, leave it in the comments. Because some stories, no matter how painful, are meant to be told. And some loyalties, no matter how tested, never fade.